Emma Carlisle was 3 months pregnant when she was shot dead on her front porch. Her husband Adam claimed he was asleep. Her best friend Julia said she hadn't spoken to Emma in days. A troubled student named Blake had vanished the same night, and a mysterious man known only as Donnelly appeared in her husband's bank records just weeks before the murder. What began as a simple tragedy soon unraveled into a web of secrets, betrayal, and a chilling question. Who really wanted Emma dead, and why did so many people have a reason to pull the trigger? Emma Carlisle lived the kind of life most people in Silver Grove admired from afar. Her soft-spoken kindness, gentle intelligence, and radiant smile made her a favorite in the community. At just 30, she had already carved a lasting place in the hearts of her students as the English teacher who cared too much, stayed too late, and remembered every birthday. Parents trusted her. Students idolized her, and fellow teachers looked to her as a quiet leader. Her home life appeared just as idyllic. Emma and her husband, Adam, had moved into a small craftsman house on Oak Ridge Lane, nestled beneath a canopy of pine trees. They were the picture of stability. No kids yet, but dreams were visibly forming. Neighbors often saw them walking their golden retriever in the evenings, sipping coffee on the porch in the mornings, or painting the garage door together on weekends. It was hard not to admire the life they'd built. That's why what happened on the night of October 3rd sent such a deep, unsettling chill through the town. It had been a perfectly normal Tuesday, at least on the surface. That afternoon, Emma stood before a crowd of students and faculty in the school gymnasium, giving a small speech during the Staff Appreciation Assembly. Halfway through, she paused, smiled softly, and placed a hand over her belly. "There's one more reason to celebrate today," she said. "I'm expecting." The applause had been thunderous. Students leapt to their feet, teachers embraced her, and even the school principal wiped away a tear. Emma's eyes searched the crowd and found Adam standing near the exit doors, clapping with a tight-lipped smile. Some noticed he didn't move to join her on stage. Fewer would mention later how quickly he left. Emma stayed behind for photos and congratulations, then headed home just before sunset. A few students claimed to have seen her sitting in her car in the parking lot afterward, alone for nearly 15 minutes, staring at her phone with a blank expression. It was odd, but not enough to raise alarm. That night, around 9:30 p.m., a neighbor across the street heard what she thought were fireworks, 2 sharp pops followed by silence. She looked out her window and saw nothing out of the ordinary. The streetlight near Emma's driveway had gone out earlier that week, and the shadows were thick. At 9:47 p.m., a passing jogger noticed Emma lying face down on her driveway. Her phone was still in her pocket. Her purse was untouched. Her keys were just a few feet away, and the porch light had been turned off. The paramedics pronounced her dead at the scene. She had been shot twice at close range, once in the chest and once in the abdomen. The wounds were clean, deliberate. No one saw a car. No one heard a scream. No one had any idea why someone would kill a pregnant woman in cold blood just hours after she shared her joy with the world. In the days that followed, a creeping unease settled over Silver Grove. The town that once felt cozy now seemed hollow, watchful, suspicious. Candlelight vigils were held, interviews conducted, and tears shed. But behind every hug was a whispered question. Why Emma? Why now? Everyone loved her. Everyone knew her. But someone close, had known her just a little too well. And in that knowing, had found a reason to pull the trigger. The morning after Emma Carlisle's murder, the town of Silver Grove awoke with a sense of disbelief that hung over everything like fog. The streets were quieter than usual, the air heavier. At Silver Grove High School, classes were canceled, but students still showed up, forming silent clusters on the lawn where they had once laughed and joked under Emma's watchful, encouraging presence. Handwritten notes, sunflowers, and candles formed a growing memorial on the steps outside the front entrance. No one could understand how someone so full of life could be extinguished so quickly, so violently. The local news ran the story by sunrise: beloved teacher, pregnant, shot outside her home. But the headlines only scratched the surface. Underneath the heartbreak was a growing sense of unease. Nothing was stolen. There were no signs of a break-in, no evidence of a struggle. Whoever killed Emma didn't come to take, they came to end. And they knew exactly where she would be. Detective Laura Mendez was assigned to the case before the coroner had even completed the death certificate. She had worked Silver Grove's quiet precinct for nearly 2 decades, but nothing in her experience had prepared her for this. Not because it was the town's first murder, it wasn't, but because it was the first that felt so personal. Teachers weren't supposed to die in their driveways. Not here, not in this way. As she arrived on Oak Ridge Lane, the crime scene was already cordoned off with yellow tape, the white chalk outline still drying in the morning dew. Emma's body had already been removed, but her presence lingered. A mug of herbal tea still sat on the porch railing. Her slippers were beside the front door. Nothing was out of place, except for the 2 bullets that had shattered her world. Neighbors had been interviewed, but few had anything useful to offer. One woman mentioned hearing a muffled argument, but couldn't make out the voices. Another claimed to have seen a shadow cross the lawn but assumed it was a deer. No one saw a car. No one heard her scream. The porch light being off gave whoever pulled the trigger the perfect cover. It was almost as if they had known her routines. As Laura moved through the house, she noticed little things. A baby book on the kitchen counter, a sonogram picture pinned to the fridge, a half-finished letter to a friend left on the dining table. There were no signs of forced entry, no disturbed furniture, nothing stolen. It looked like Emma had simply come home, gotten comfortable, and walked outside, maybe to meet someone. Maybe not. Curiosity turned into suspicion as Laura reviewed Emma's final hours. The pregnancy announcement had been public, joyous. Everyone had seen it. Everyone had heard it. And someone who already knew, had decided that news couldn't be allowed to spread further. Whispers began to travel through the town like wildfire. Some speculated that a stranger had followed her home, that it was random, but that theory didn't hold for long. Others believed it was a former student, someone unstable, obsessed. That too felt too convenient, too far removed. The truth, Laura believed, was somewhere closer. Someone who knew Emma's patterns. Someone who had seen her happiness firsthand and couldn't bear it. It wasn't just the loss of Emma Carlisle that haunted Silver Grove. It was the realization that her killer might be walking among them, attending the same vigils, offering the same tears, maybe even pretending to mourn. Every sympathetic hug, every concerned glance, now carried an edge of suspicion. And as Laura Mendez stood in Emma's quiet kitchen, surrounded by echoes of a life abruptly halted, she felt it in her bones. This wasn't about the baby. It wasn't even about Emma. It was about something buried deeper. Something someone had killed to keep hidden. From the start, Adam Carlisle's name lingered in every corner of the investigation, not because there was evidence against him, but because of how carefully he seemed to avoid being part of the grief. In the hours after his wife's murder, he hadn't appeared at the hospital, hadn't spoken to the press, and hadn't contacted Emma's family. When detectives arrived to interview him the next morning, they found him alone in the living room, lights off, a bottle of whiskey on the table, and not a single photograph of Emma in sight. He told them he had been watching a football game at home during the time of the murder. The game had started at 8:30 p.m. and ended shortly after, but when the police checked his phone records, there were no calls, no texts, no internet searches, just silence during the critical window between 9 and 10 p.m., the exact time Emma had died. Laura Mendez took note of the details. Adam wasn't crying. He wasn't even angry. His tone was flat, mechanical, and distant, as if reciting from a script rather than remembering his wife. He said he hadn't heard anything unusual that night. Said he assumed Emma was staying late with a friend, but the way he said it lacked the confusion, the panic, the disbelief she expected from a grieving husband. Neighbors added more complexity to the puzzle. One couple next door told police they had heard arguing earlier in the evening, shouting, then silence, followed by what sounded like slamming doors. Another neighbor 2 houses down recalled hearing something sharp and violent, but dismissed it as a firecracker or a falling trash bin. When pressed, one detail stood out: the male voice in the argument sounded familiar. Still, there were no signs of forced entry, no blood inside the house, no weapon found. Without physical evidence, suspicions could only grow so far, but as word spread through Silvergrove, Adam's absence became louder than any accusation. He skipped the second vigil entirely. While students, teachers, and Emma's parents gathered at the school to share stories and tears, Adam stayed home. A local reporter knocked on his door for comment. He didn't answer. Hours later, the same reporter noticed something peculiar. Adam had removed every photo of Emma from his social media. When asked about it later, he brushed it off as a coping mechanism, claiming it was too painful to see her face. But to the town, it looked like he was erasing her. Bit by bit, Laura couldn't ignore what was missing. A man who had just lost his pregnant wife should have been falling apart, reaching out for help, drowning in sorrow. Instead, Adam was building walls, fast, cold, unshakable. He gave short answers, avoided eye contact, and never once asked if they had found the person who did it. Then came the bank records. In the weeks before Emma's death, Adam had made 3 large withdrawals, each under $10,000 in cash. When asked about the money, he claimed it was for home repairs, but no contractors in the area reported being hired. No permits had been filed. The house showed no sign of renovation. Where the money went, no one knew. Laura began to suspect that Adam Carlisle wasn't just hiding something. He was expecting something, preparing for it. The silence around him wasn't grief. It was calculation. Every piece of his life that involved Emma was being carefully, methodically stripped away. But without the gun, without a motive they could prove, and without a witness who could place him at the scene, they couldn't touch him. Not yet. Still, as the investigation deepened, Laura knew one thing for certain. Adam wasn't just avoiding the past. He was afraid of something catching up to him, something he thought he'd buried, something he might kill to keep buried. The discovery of Emma Carlisle's private journal came almost by accident. While cataloging items from her desk at Silvergrove High, an officer opened a drawer marked personal and found a small USB flash drive tucked beneath a stack of poetry books. Laura Mendez took it back to the station, expecting little more than lesson plans or old student essays. But what she uncovered was something entirely different. A single password-protected file titled Private Journal. With the help of the tech team, the file was unlocked within hours, and what they found inside shifted the investigation into darker territory. The journal entries dated back nearly a year. Emma had used the file to document her personal life, frustrations, and observations. Most entries were mundane reflections, school issues, relationship doubts, little victories. But scattered among them were notes about a student, Blake Harrow. His name first appeared casually. She described him as intense, sharp, maybe too aware of me. As the months progressed, the entries became more serious. Emma wrote about moments that unsettled her. Blake lingering after class too long, staring during lessons, and once following her to her car under the excuse of asking about homework. By spring, Emma's tone had shifted entirely. She described Blake as obsessive, unpredictable, and most haunting of all, like someone who already decided we were meant to be. She had spoken to school counselors and documented her concerns with the administration. Blake was suspended twice for inappropriate behavior, but returned each time with apologies and promises to do better. Emma had even requested a classroom change after finding a handwritten note in her mailbox. "You looked beautiful today. He doesn't deserve you." When detectives brought Blake Harrow in for questioning, he didn't hesitate to speak. Thin, pale, and unnervingly calm, the 17-year-old didn't deny his feelings. He described Emma in glowing, poetic terms. His muse, his anchor. He said he'd written dozens of letters to her but never gave them, that he'd dreamt about her since his sophomore year, that she was the only person who had ever truly seen him. What disturbed Laura most wasn't his obsession. It was the way he spoke about her pregnancy. "She never should have let that happen," he said. "She told me she loved me once." When pressed, he couldn't produce any proof of that claim. He said it had happened during a tutoring session, when she touched his hand and smiled. Laura noted his fixation, his confusion of affection with fantasy, and the dangerously blurred lines in his mind. Blake admitted he'd followed Emma home twice, once months ago, and once just last week. He said he waited in his car, parked down the street, just to see if she smiled when she got out. He insisted he never approached her, but the timing was too close, too deliberate. When asked where he was on the night of Emma's murder, Blake claimed he was at home, alone, writing. He even provided pages of his writing, disturbing, cryptic poems about heartbreak, jealousy, and destruction. A search of his room revealed more. In a locked drawer beneath his bed, detectives found a collection of photos taken secretly. Emma leaving school, Emma at the grocery store, Emma standing at her window, each one dated, labeled, catalogued. There was no weapon, but the growing evidence painted a chilling portrait of a young man detached from reality, emotionally unstable and dangerously obsessed. But there was one thing that didn't sit right with Laura. For all of Blake's fixation, there was no mention in his photos or writings about the pregnancy. It was as if that detail had thrown him off, shocked him, and something about that reaction felt genuine. Emma had seen the danger. She'd warned people, she'd documented it all. But still, had Blake only watched? Or had he finally decided to act when he realized she was slipping further away? There was one other possibility Laura couldn't ignore. What if someone knew about Blake's obsession and used it for cover? The discovery of a second pregnancy test, found during Emma Carlisle's autopsy, came as a quiet shock to the investigation. It wasn't hers. At least, it hadn't been used by her. The test was tucked inside a small decorative box found in her bedside drawer, wrapped in tissue paper, and marked only with the initials JP. Emma had been 3 months pregnant with a child everyone assumed was Adam's, but why would she keep someone else's pregnancy test, especially hidden like that? The initials would become the first thread in a web detective Laura Mendez hadn't yet imagined. A quick scan of faculty records produced a match. Julia Porter, 31, history teacher, and Emma's colleague, and according to school staff, her closest friend. The two had been almost inseparable for years. Emma often referred to Julia as her school sister. They'd co-chaired clubs, planned student retreats together, and spent hours after school sharing lesson plans and coffee in each other's classrooms. But when detectives began asking questions, a different image emerged. One of tension, of something fractured beneath the surface of their friendship. When Laura visited Julia at her home, she didn't look surprised. Her eyes were red but dry. She said she was heartbroken, but her words felt practiced, filtered. She admitted the initials were hers when shown the test. "It's mine," she said quickly, before trying to pivot away. "But it's not what you think." According to Julia, she had taken the test nearly 6 weeks earlier. She hadn't told anyone, except Emma. She said she confided in her friend after a staff meeting, terrified and overwhelmed. She hadn't expected to be pregnant, and she certainly hadn't planned it. When Laura asked who the father was, Julia hesitated, then said quietly, "I'd rather not say, it's over." But nothing was ever really over in a case like this. Emma's journal, the same file that documented her furs about Blake Harrow, had one entry dated 3 weeks before her death. In it, Emma had written, "Jay told me today that she's pregnant. She thinks she might want to keep it. She didn't tell me who the father is, but I think I already know." That line changed everything. It suggested betrayal, speculation, a fracture that went deeper than anyone knew. Laura returned to Julia with the journal entry and pressed harder. Eventually, the truth came out. Julia admitted to a short-lived affair with Adam Carlisle. It had happened months earlier, during what she described as a vulnerable time. She claimed it ended quickly, and both agreed to never speak of it again. But Emma had found out recently. Julia said she came to her one evening, furious and shaking, demanding the truth. and she gave it. That was the last real conversation they ever had. Emma had seemed calm in public after that. But according to Julia, she had threatened to confront Adam, possibly even leave him. She said Emma had mentioned going to her parents, maybe even the police, not about the affair, but about something else. But when Laura asked what that something else might be, Julia shrugged and said, "I don't know," she wouldn't say. But she was scared. It was clear that Emma had known more than she let on. She had held secrets about her own life and those of people around her, secrets that were unraveling one by one. And now, with Julia's confession, everything took on a darker tone. Emma had been betrayed by her closest friend. She had just discovered that the man she loved had been unfaithful, and perhaps fathered another woman's child. The tension, the fury, the sense of unraveling, all of it was leading somewhere. But what stood out most to Laura wasn't the affair, it was how calm Julia seemed when recounting it. There was no shame, no regret, just calculation, measured words. The kind of words you use when you've already decided what version of the story you're willing to live with. And maybe, what version you're willing to kill for. 2 weeks after Emma Carlisle's murder, the investigation had shifted from a local tragedy to a tangle of secrets, jealousy, and betrayal. Detective Laura Mendez had followed every thread: Emma's troubled student Blake Harrow, the hidden affair between her husband Adam and best friend Julia Porter, the mysterious second pregnancy test. But nothing had led to a direct suspect. Each lead painted a picture of motive. But no one had been placed at the scene. That changed when a new piece of evidence emerged, one that had been hiding in plain sight. Emma's car had been impounded the night of her death, its contents logged but largely overlooked. It had paired clean, unremarkable. But a second, more detailed sweep turned up a small black dash camera, partially hidden beneath the dashboard. The device wasn't part of the factory system. It had been installed manually, likely by Emma herself. It wasn't recording during the day, it was triggered by motion or impact, activated only when the car was off and someone got too close. Laura had it fast-tracked through digital recovery. The footage from the night of the murder was grainy but usable. Around 9:22 p.m., movement near the driveway triggered the camera. A figure, tall, lean, moving quickly, approached the car and passed into the darkness toward the porch. A few seconds later, a flicker of light flared in the lower frame, then another, muzzle flashes. 2 of them, and then silence. The figure turned, walking back down the driveway. The camera caught the back of the head, the outline of the jacket, but no clear face. Just before stepping out of frame, the person paused, glanced toward the car for a half-second, and disappeared into the shadows. Still, it was enough to narrow the timeline and prove the murder was committed with cold precision. Laura re-examined every alibi with the footage's timestamp in mind. That's when another detail surfaced. Julia Porter's phone had pinged a tower less than 4 blocks from Emma's house at exactly 9:18 p.m. 4 minutes before the first muzzle flash. Julia had claimed she was home all night. Now her story didn't hold. Confronted with this, Julia denied everything. She insisted the ping must have been a glitch, that maybe she had driven past earlier in the day and her phone just picked up the tower again. But digital forensics didn't lie. The signal wasn't passive, it was active. Her phone had received a message at that time, a notification from a navigation app, and when pressed further, another unsettling revelation emerged. The app had been directing her to Oak Ridge Lane. Why would Julia need directions to the street her closest friend lived on, a place she'd visited countless times? Laura had no answers, only more questions. And while Julia's phone data was damning, it wasn't conclusive. The camera hadn't captured a face. No weapon had been recovered, and while circumstantial evidence was piling up like storm clouds, no one piece could tie the gun to the hand that pulled the trigger. But then came a twist no one expected. A gun, partially buried beneath a pile of leaves in a wooded area less than a mile from Emma's home, was found by a dog walker. It was wrapped in a scarf, black wool with tiny white embroidery on the edges. The same kind of scarf Julia had worn in several photos taken just weeks before. Ballistics confirmed the gun was the murder weapon. When Laura brought Julia back in, she stayed quiet for a long time. Then, for the first time since the investigation began, she spoke in a voice almost too soft to hear. "I didn't mean for it to happen like that." She said no more. No confession. No explanation. Just that single sentence. And just like that, the puzzle was almost complete. But one question still echoed louder than ever in Laura's mind. If Julia pulled the trigger, was it truly her idea, or was someone else quietly guiding her hand? Detective Laura Mendez stared at the crime board in her office, the red strings now leading in every direction. Blake Harrow's obsession, Julia Porter's betrayal, Adam Carlisle's coldness. But something still didn't feel finished. Julia had all but confessed, but not in the way Laura expected. "I didn't mean for it to happen like that." It wasn't a denial. It wasn't quite an admission either. It was a middle ground. A place where guilt lived, but maybe not intent. Laura reviewed the gun again. It had been wiped clean of prints, wrapped in Julia's scarf, and tossed miles from where it could be found easily. It was too clean, too strategic. Not something someone would do in a panic. Not something Julia, emotional and impulsive, would think to do alone. But Adam Carlisle, he had always been methodical, distant, unemotional, the type of man who wouldn't hesitate to clean up a mess, especially if it threatened his carefully constructed life. Then came the financials. Again. Laura returned to the strange withdrawals Adam had made. 3 in cash, each under $10,000. She had dismissed it earlier as suspicious but untraceable. Now, with new context, she revisited the surveillance footage from the bank's ATM near the last withdrawal. There, in grainy black and white footage, Laura spotted a flash of someone standing just behind Adam, half-shadowed, waiting. It wasn't Julia. It wasn't Blake. It was someone else entirely. James Donnelly. A name buried deep in Adam's business records. A private contractor. Former military. No official job title. No public-facing presence. He had once worked security for Adam's investment firm but disappeared from the records 6 months earlier. Laura pulled up Donnelly's file. No criminal record, but plenty of red flags, multiple addresses, a history of vanishing after jobs and rumors of offshore ties. She tracked down a traffic camera from 3 nights before Emma's murder. A black SUV, registered to Donnelly, appeared parked less than a block from Emma's house for over 2 hours. Again, no explanation, but the timestamps aligned perfectly with the hours leading up to her death. When Laura brought Donnelly in, he barely blinked. He denied everything with rehearsed ease. "Wrong car," he said. "Must have been a mistake." But when she laid the surveillance photos on the table, the ATM, the street, the footage from Emma's dashcam catching a similar figure, his jaw tightened, just enough for her to see through the cracks. It all began to make sense. Julia, broken from betrayal and shame, had likely confided in Adam. Perhaps she told him Emma had found out. Maybe she even threatened to tell the school board, or Emma's parents or the police. And Adam, watching his perfect image begin to fracture, had decided to act, not emotionally, but strategically. He didn't just want Emma gone, he wanted her to be the victim of someone else's spiral. Blake Harrow had been the perfect decoy. His obsession had been well documented. His mental state unstable, his presence near the scene was suspicious enough to distract. Julia, emotionally vulnerable, had been the perfect pawn, furious at Emma, confused, and still holding on to Adam in a way that made her malleable. All Adam had to do was point the anger in the right direction. Suggest fear. Suggest betrayal. Suggest that maybe Emma had gone too far. Laura theorized that Donnelly had been paid to carry out the cleanup, to wrap the gun, toss the scarf, erase the evidence. Julia may have fired the gun, or she may have simply been there when it happened. Either way, someone else had made sure the scene looked clean, clean enough for doubt. But there was still no confession, no fingerprint on the trigger, just shadows and silence. Still, Laura had learned something important. The truth wasn't just about who pulled the trigger, it was about who planned for her to die, and who made sure it looked like someone else did. The courtroom buzzed with restrained tension. Reporters filled the back rows, sketch artists hunched over their pads, and every seat was taken by someone desperate to understand how a beloved teacher, newly pregnant, ended up shot dead on her front porch. But as the trial for Julia Porter opened, the truth remained as layered and deceptive as it had been the night Emma Carlisle was murdered. Julia sat at the defendant's table, her expression unreadable. Charged with second-degree murder and obstruction of justice, she was both the accused and, in many ways, the centerpiece of a crime that still felt unfinished. Prosecutors painted her as a woman consumed by jealousy and betrayal, someone who snapped under the weight of humiliation and heartbreak. They presented the scarf, the gun, the phone data, all pieces that placed Julia at the scene. But Detective Laura Mendez knew the case was far more complex than that. Julia's defense told a different story. Her lawyer claimed she had gone to Emma's house that night. Yes, but not to kill her. She went to talk, to explain. She hadn't known about the pregnancy until that day. And when she saw Emma's post online, everything unraveled. She claimed Emma had refused to speak with her for weeks. That night, she just wanted to make things right. But the timeline was unkind to her. The dashcam, the gun, the scarf. It all pointed more than just a conversation. Julia didn't deny being there. What she denied was pulling the trigger. Laura watched the proceedings from the side bench, hands clasped tightly. She knew the whole truth hadn't come out yet. Not in the courtroom, not on paper. Emma's murder had never been about one person's rage. It had been about control, and all signs still pointed to Adam Carlisle. But Adam was a ghost in the trial. He was called as a witness, yes, but not as a subject. Calm and measured in his responses, he portrayed himself as a grieving husband, betrayed by both his wife and his mistress. He admitted the affair. He admitted knowing about Julia's pregnancy, but he denied any involvement in Emma's death. When asked about James Donnelly, he said only that the man had done contract work for his firm. No more, no less. Yet Laura had never stopped digging. Behind the scenes, she had built a quiet but damning profile of Adam's actions in the months leading up to the murder. The payments to Donnelly, the deletion of surveillance logs at his office the morning after Emma's death, and perhaps most importantly, the insurance policy taken out on Emma, updated just 2 weeks before her murder, doubling the payout in the event of a violent death. The beneficiary? Adam Carlisle. But money alone wasn't motive enough. The key had always been manipulation. Laura believed Adam had used Julia's rambling emotional state to his advantage. She was already broken by guilt. Emma had found out everything, and Adam, calculating and cold, saw an opportunity to push her further, just enough to make her believe Emma was a threat. Just enough to make her show up that night. But Julia hadn't expected a gun. That, Laura believed, had been Donnelly's role. With no physical evidence linking Donnelly to the gun, and with Julia refusing to name names, there wasn't enough to charge anyone else. Not yet. But Laura wasn't done. She had submitted a sealed request for federal surveillance warrants on both Donnelly and Adam Carlisle. She was determined to prove conspiracy. It would take time, patience, and silence. As the trial neared its end, the jury returned its verdict, guilty of manslaughter and evidence tampering. Julia wept as the sentence was read, not out of injustice, but perhaps out of relief. Her silence had protected someone, but the weight of truth had finally caught up. Outside the courthouse, Laura looked up at the gray sky. The case wasn't over, not truly. She knew the most dangerous man in the entire story was still walking free. But the story had been cracked open, and now, it was only a matter of time before the final name would be written beneath the word guilty.